So we have about 30 students living here. Well, we're living here in Los Angeles as part of our Cal Poly LA Metro program. And they're all great. It's been kind of a crazy year, right? Crazy 3 months, and we're doing the best we all can to hang in there and continue our project. It's a 20-week, 2-quarter project that we work on together here in Los Angeles. They have a lot of other things they do, intern and offices and things like that. And we work as a team of people to teach them all together in one collective. It's maybe a different model of education. I don't know, something's forming here, which is kind of interesting. But you know, I'm here all the time as director of the program, but also organizing and designing the design studio and teaching in the design studios. And Ismael Soto, he's right here. He's one of our former Cal Poly grads who went off to UCLA. I don't know, Dana, if you ran into him, he was in Greg Lynn's studio and then went on to UN Studios office and Zaha's office and Himmelblau's office. And then now he's at Rio's Clemente Hale. And he's teaching, he's been with us, you know, pretty much you come in every day for a little bit and helping out the students has been fantastic. And then Pavel Getov, who I don't know if he's here yet. He usually comes in the afternoon in these reviews. I see Teddy's here too. So I'm gonna promote him to, yeah, I know I have so many management things here. And so we have Pavel Getov, who you probably all know. I don't know, Natalie, if you know him as well, but I know Dana, of course, you know him, but he was at Morphosis and he runs his own office studio and Dennis. He teaches at SciArc and he does a lot of design development work. He's been joining in our studio in the second half, also with Teddy in the second half. And here's Teddy, just showed up, who work in design and practice and also the helping to support. We also have Fabio Zangoli, structural engineer who's from Labib, and he comes in and helps our students with their structural systems in the end too. And then Sarah Hearne and Alex Maymind, both of UCLA, so Dana knows them. They teach our HTC classes with us. So it's kind of a really fun collective kind of thing. We all have the exact same project. It's all managed together. We all work collectively. So we have great reviewers here today. Hitoshi's running a little bit late, but we all know he's a professor at UCLA and runs his own office. Dana Cuff, who just gave a lecture the other night. So Dana, nice to see you from City Lab and UCLA professor. Nataly Gaetano here from FutureForms. Jason Kelly Johnson, also of FutureForms, was here in our first session. And,
yeah.
Nataly and Jason and I know each other from Winston Times. And then Allyne Winderman from Cal Poly Pomona also did a lot of work at West Hollywood on housing and in terms of, you're in the planning, right, City? Yeah.
Yeah, planning development, yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting to have you here. We have a complex project. So we have, we're gonna try to do 5 students today. So we're gonna try to keep on time, and I apologize if I start shutting us down, but we'll just then get into another conversation and bring it along to the next group. So Jordyn Voss, Arthur Santos, Nadthachai, he likes to go by Int, Francois, and then Ezra will be presenting. And they have very different projects. So I think you'll see 5 different solutions to a complex problem. So we begin our studios always with an architectural project that is outside of scale, outside of program, and actually outside of site, although there is a site designed within that. It brings in issues that I choose to every single quarter. This one was mostly about geometries, and giving them sort of an architectural interest to start dealing with and creating spaces, which I've been arguing sort of spaces of the in-between, sort of inside, outside spaces that kind of move between interiority and exteriority, but also sets up interesting sort of architectural questions. Then we separate that out. Then we begin with the program and a site, and we do site analysis. We also do a lot of case studies, about 30 of them, mostly in housing this year. The building program is quite large. It's 660,000 square feet, divided into housing and commercial and public space. There's multi-income housing and hotels with a boutique and a transient hotel component. We have a social and health services embedded in the project. There's creative office and retail, and also a very an interest in interior and exterior spaces and those urban spaces in the in-between. Again, micro unit housing, transient hotel, boutique hotel, high to mid income housing, mid to low income housing, and transitional family housing as well. We also have a commercial public sector. We have the public restaurants, cafes, and retail type spaces. We have a flexible creative office space. We have exhibition gallery and public spaces and public landscape spaces. So our site is in downtown Los Angeles. This, you know, here's downtown, here's the building site on Main Street, right next to the fashion district in Skid Row, but right in the sort of transitional spot between the higher portion of the city and the more manufacturing type history of the city. It's an interesting site in terms of its urbanism, which is also part of what we're interested in. It's got an open space in front of it that's kind of forced by the kind of triangular site that got created in front of it. It also then has 3 facades that face the street, one against a back alley, and then we took the whole territory. There's a few existing buildings, and we just decided as a project not to keep them and to build up that site with our program and try to figure out what to do with that space. I also set a 12-story height limit in the territory. We often do skyscrapers in this class, and I wanted to try to work more on landscape sort of, or more urbanism on that level, on a horizontal territory. So to think about the site on Main Street between 9th Street, 8th Street, and the alley on Worden Place, it's a 625 feet by 175 feet. That creates a 110,000 square foot lot. Because we have a 660,000 square foot building and we're allowed to go up 12 stories, you're gonna get about a 50% porosity built into the project. And where you put that porosity, how you design that porosity will become part of the strategies that the students have to think about. Again, you know, architecture, the spaces of the in-between become very important in this studio as a strategy. Every student's working in these territories and having an architectural concept where they deal with form and material. They have an urban concept where they manage and think about site strategies and what those might mean. And then there's an organizational programmatic concept, how you organize the spaces and the relationships between those spaces that can be quite socio-political if you take that on. And I'm going to then stop sharing and we're gonna jump, sorry. We're gonna jump to Jordyn, who's gonna take us through her project for the next 20 minutes or so with you guys. Jordyn?
Hi, I'll get my screen shared right now for you.
All right. And then Hitoshi might just jump in at some point and don't worry about it. Okay.
Alrighty.
Could I introduce the critics? I always keep forgetting if I did that. I did do that. All right.
Okay, so my project is entitled Optic. And over the course of the past 2 quarters, I've really been looking at pattern in terms of op art, as well as social organization, given the complexity of our program, as well as the site location. So as Stephen kind of explained, our site is located right downtown, kind of in the heart of some key quintessential areas. So the financial district, the fashion district, and Skid Row. So with that being said, I really wanted to break down my program. Sorry, I was having some slight difficulties. I really wanted to break down my program into 5 key interactive levels. So the highest being the street edge and the street interface. And you'll see on my site plan how I try to pull back the street edge to allow for more interactive space on that ground level. And then the lowest being more personal units within housing, the boutique hotel, transient hotel, as well as the micro units. And within all of those, there's 3 other categories: high, medium, low. High being the retail, lobbies, ground floor and atria and courtyards, medium being the larger community center, creative office and social services, and low being the shared community spaces and shared balconies within the unit. And then within the overall form, there's 6 main sections. And within each of those 6 sections, I wanted to try and have as many interactive levels as possible. So all of them contain at least 4 of those interactive levels, and then the ground floor has all 5, given the street edge condition. So with my site plan and the ground floor, these are some of the main areas where I pulled back that street edge to create more space for interaction here on the right-hand side and on the left, as well as with some inlet parking. And then I also wanted to add some green space because that's something that is pretty devoid from downtown LA. And then over here on the right-hand side, with this larger inlet, we have the leasing office. Social services, so we have the health services lobby, a computer room for the public, as well as food services. And then moving towards the center, I have a loading dock, package center mail room, a housing lobby with a bar and lounge associated with it. The center has area for a large art gallery. And then on the left-hand side, we have retail and security. And then moving up a couple floors to the 6th floor, this is where the main community center is located. And on this floor, we also have some family housing. And within each family housing unit, we also have an attached balcony and a shared balcony to encourage more interaction between units. And then each floor also has a larger shared communal balcony for all of the residents on that floor, just to encourage more interaction. And then this floor in particular has that direct connection to the community center, which is located directly above the transient hotel and micro-unit housing, and directly below more family housing and the creative office space. And then working intersectionally, there are these large voids and atria that go throughout the building. And this is where a lot of the community spaces are centered. So those shared balconies, as well as the community center here. In terms of program, we have the leasing office here on the right-hand side, working up into transient hotel, micro units, family housing in the community center, and finally the creative office on the top level. And then in the longitudinal section, you can further see some of these void and atria, both vertically and horizontally. So the smaller void spaces throughout the building are used as those smaller community and gathering spaces. And then programmatically, we have retail space down here on the bottom right. On the bottom left is where the social services, leasing office, and support services are located. And then working up more into the housing, boutique hotel on the right-hand side, and the creative office once again on the top level. And then these were just some initial formal studies I had done exploring those sectional qualities of void within the overall form, and then ultimately moving forward with a combination of the 3 in the blue. And then apart from form, I've also been working with pattern and op art. So utilizing op art to kind of manipulate and confuse the form. So
You're breaking up.
Oh, sorry about that. So utilizing op art to kind of control and confuse the form. So there's areas with more dense and larger patterning that are meant to draw certain elements forward, and then areas with less dense patterning kind of release into the background. Even if they may actually be on the same plane, they appear to be on different planes due to the patterning. And then also using these larger planes to further divide the pattern and also the form. So here we can see the larger planes wrapping from one surface to the other. And here we have a plane that's combining 2 forms that aren't on the same level. And this was more so dealing with an opaque pattern, treating the form as a canvas and overlaying pattern on top. And then I also did another version playing with the overall form becoming translucent and disappearing and relying solely on the pattern to push forward that form. And it does become somewhat illegible in areas with how dense the pattern becomes, because you are getting a read of the pattern from both sides. And then this is just a comparison of those 2 studies. And then I was also looking at the form and the pattern as you start to move around it. Depending on the depth and the density of the pattern elements, certain areas become more opaque depending on your location and where you're standing in view of the project. And then trying to kind of grasp that pattern and turn it more into a realistic facade, I decided to turn the pattern into a series of vertical and horizontal louvers, which you can see both in the wall section and this little chunk model we have down here. And you can also see some of those shared balcony spaces that we have, as well as some of those void spaces throughout the project that become those community spaces. And then this was an early physical model I'd done exploring the sectional qualities of the form. And then a final sectional model with the pattern overlaid on top of the form. And then that is all I have for you today.
Thanks, Jordyn. It was helpful to kind of navigate into the concept board to zoom into some of the material just to kind of understand what you were setting up in terms of pattern. Just a question, just for a clarification point. When you talk about this, the relationship between the form and the pattern, can you clarify that a little bit? Because I was kind of looking through the formal iteration studies and trying to understand if the pattern is applied or if the form is generated in some ways by the pattern. Like, what is that dialogue that you're setting up?
Definitely. So the form was generated before the pattern, and then I kind of just treated the form as a canvas for the pattern to be overlaid on top of, and then seeing how those pattern elements can start to manipulate and control the form as a whole.
Nataly, were you done with what you're saying?
Yeah, go ahead. I just wanted a clarifying point and just to get the conversation going.
Yeah, appreciate it. Well, first of all, I just think this is a terrific presentation. You know, the drawings and everything, the clarity of your thought, how you've organized things is very exceptional. So, and there's a garbage truck pulling out in front of my house right now. So sorry. Let me know if you can't hear it, and I'll relinquish the floor. But have you, I guess maybe two bigger questions. One is, how does this form, in particular the patterning, does it reflect anything in the neighborhood? It's sort of, in some ways, an alien being, and it's very, very large. So, you know, how do you see that? And so that's one question. And an unrelated question is about the, this is a very challenging program, and a lot of things that often you don't see together, like a boutique hotel and a transient hotel, or low-income housing and mixed income housing. So I just wonder how have you addressed those things? Or what do you think of those things? Not addressing them like they're problems, but how do you think about them?
So I think the program could easily become a very divisive thing within the project, because a lot of those programmatic elements are a lot of people who don't usually interact with each other. So that's where I tried to use those smaller community spaces to encourage interaction and a more cohesive flow throughout the program, throughout the project as a whole.
Yeah, very good idea.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So, although I'm getting an echo, do you hear an echo?
A little echoey, but it's fine.
I feel like the management of the program and the presentation is super clear. Sort of like a organizational chart. But what I'm wondering about is, I think what Allyne was asking about too, what's your goal in the project? Like the whole structure of the interaction levels, which seems to be a really strong principle, I think is based on the notion that if people have inadvertent and casual interactions, they're more likely to find their common ground. And that's a theory, right? Some people say, you know, the more friction, the more friction. So I think it's an important principle to kind of call out. And it would help, I think, given how thorough and complicated your project is, to have a set of priorities that you can express and explain your building. So to say, in the interaction spaces, there's always an alternative to move into a more private passage, but there's a choice that's at every circulation turning point. You can either enter the shared spaces or go into a less interactive zone, which may be in fact exactly what you've done. Can you show us a space where you've tried to achieve that kind of community level interaction that you're prioritizing?
Yeah, let me go back a couple floors to a plan I have. So, see if we can zoom in. Alrighty, so it won't let me zoom in, but on the 6th floor plan that we have, within all the housing levels, the way I divided it is, in terms of interactive level, is I considered the community center to be more of a level 3, so a high interactive space. And then transgressing over into the housing portion of the building, there's the individual units, which obviously are the most private, but connected to each of these units, which I can't quite zoom in on, is a smaller shared balcony. So between 2 to 3 units have a smaller balcony, so less people per area. And then down here on the bottom left is a larger balcony for the entirety of all housing units on that level. So kind of working in levels, if that answers your question.
Completely, Jordyn. And, you know, I think it's actually pretty sophisticated what you've done. And your presentation is so thorough that I'm only missing that kind of description, where I think if I were going to say what's really remarkable about your project, it's that there are a series of secondary spaces that you've tried to make primary, which would be these kind of mixing chambers for the diverse programmatic occupants that the building houses. And, you know, really architecturally to do that is kind of amazing. So I just want to commend you for that, and to suggest that you really elevate that in the way you think about it and even present the project, which is all of that gets sort of professionally muted by how thorough it is.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see diagrams that show us that. It'd be lovely. The only other thing I have a question about, which you also didn't really speak about, is that the whole building is punctured and, you know, kind of like early Rogers building, or Piano and Rogers building, the London Tower, where you see these kind of mechanistic connections and holes of assembly. And I'm not sure why that was the architectural choice that you made, because it seems like a very important one to you.
That was initially driven from some of the earlier strictly formal studies that we had done, and this came before we received any programmatic or site elements for the project. So it was mainly just a formal exploration that did in turn, those punctures started to turn into those shared community spaces.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Dana, you should,
No,
you should
please.
complete it. No, I was just going to kind of follow up on that, because in my little notes here, I was just kind of trying to track a little bit of your kind of idea of interaction and to connect it to form. That's why I was kind of trying to like figure out where are the holes coming from? How does the pattern connect to form? How does that connect to your larger argument about interaction? Because I think those are the threads that I feel like your presentation is so thorough. I'm convinced that you've thought about, and it's somewhere there. It's just that it may just need to be pulled out into the foreground a little bit more. You're making this equation where you're basically saying that to increase interaction, or in the way that you presented it, at least, interaction equals sharing. Like a shared space equates to interaction. And I would say, well, yes, of course it does, but there's so many other ways that you could interact with, right? And as you were kind of talking through the patterning, I was like, okay, and now she's going to use the patterning to tell me how you can create different degrees and levels of interaction, right? So yes, I'm in my apartment, but do I really always want to have this kind of shared space in front of my, I don't know, bedroom or deck or whatever, right? Is there part of your like patterning that can actually camouflage? As you said, like I was just thinking of the dazzle camouflage, right? Where I could maybe dazzle camouflage part of my neighbor because it's great and I love bumping into them, but maybe I don't want to see them all the time, right? So would there be a way for you to maybe more strategically and opportunistically leverage the pattern to, and also this puncturing that Dana brought up, right? To either reveal something below or hide or conceal or veil, right? So it's not an on-off, shared, not shared, kind of shared, sort of shared, but there's also a kind of visual buffer or layering that you can leverage the pattern for. So at that point, it would almost be a diagram of, you talked about the different levels of interaction, but I would also want to see like the pattern for a level 3 versus a level 5, or the form for a level 3 versus a level 5. And then how do those two come together? I totally buy, what you're saying, that it's a canvas that you apply onto, but at some point they would like really like connect and hook into each other and be codependent. So I think the dots are there, like the pearls like on the necklace are there. You just kind of need to like find a way to kind of thread them through.
But it would really help to have the why. I think that's what we're asking for. And I think that there's 2 whys going on throughout your project. The first one is this, like that you organized it so that there would be the possibility of programmatic interchange and what you're calling interaction levels. But I think the sort of dazzle and op art, which is really beautiful, by the way, and especially when you move around it and get the varying perspectives on it, I think that is to somehow break down the form because of its scale, but I'm not exactly sure because you didn't really say that. And what Nataly's suggesting is really exciting because when she's talking, I could imagine that when the vertical slats are, someone pushes their horizontal patio fence across it, it would become occluded. So you could actually make invisible what's going on either side, or you could open it up so there would be a way to make the interaction levels and the op art building scale transformation work together. And the promise of that is there. I also think if you're working on something like the scale of the building, you need to show us a little bit about what's around it. And maybe we were supposed to get that from Stephen's introduction, but it'd be really nice to just see the outline of your neighboring buildings on an occasional rendering. Hey, Hitoshi.
Hi, sorry. I was completely trapped in a meeting, so I'm sorry for being late.
Sounds so scary.
It
So,
was.
but so getting to the point of the unidentifiable characteristics of the space, I think that this is what you should be doing in the summertime. When you have a break, is that how are people using this? What identifies this space? And people just don't go. Some of the spaces are very, very big. And when you start thinking about it, oh, go to a place that's that big, it's like, oh, maybe that's not working that well. So, start getting down to that level. And I think that will help. And I do think, though, the fact that you can't identify any of these things from the outside, like what's a communal space or what's, where are the offices, what's public and semi-public. So that's another area to work on. And it's not saying it's not good now, but I think the best projects are ones that say, oh yeah, let's keep going forward with this and see where it gets me.
Definitely. I think that's all really great criticism because I hadn't really explored using the pattern to identify different programmatic elements. I had kind of thought about it, but it just isn't something that really was brought to fruition. So I think it's something I could definitely explore further.
And you didn't have much time either, I think.
I miss seeing you zoom in because you clearly have a command of the craft that you demonstrated throughout this very comprehensive presentation. But your particular passions are also treated in this kind of administrative way in my mind. And so I'd really like to see you get into one floor, show us how the plan works. I don't know how Allyne figured that out. I mean, I can't tell what's big or small because everything maybe, and it's partly Zoom. So it's also something we all have to learn is how we present our work in this sequential screen-based format where we can't walk up and look at it more closely. And you couldn't even zoom in on your project. But without that, I can't tell like how you're manipulating, say, the plan of the micro units in relationship to the various types of interaction spaces that you've created. And really that's where the craft of this building will reside. At least one aspect that's important to you will reside in that set of relationships. So, taking a piece of it, like in the chunk model, but in the programmatic element, and really making that work and showing us how you made that work would convince us that the other, 160,000 square feet or whatever it is also work.
That was a great point. All in all, I really appreciate that too. And I that's why we kind of give you these concept board links. Dan, I don't know if you were able to access those or not so easy. Sometimes they work for some people, they don't work for everybody. And we did that as a backup because I agree with you that way when they miss something in their presentation, at least you can see the whole board and kind of engage in it. And I do also agree that on Jordyn's expertise happens at that level. And that's kind of why I also really wanted to start with her, because I wanted to be able to engage those conversations, which she's done so well in her project. Managing this very complex program, and then also understanding the site conditions and then developing it. I also really like, by the way, Jordyn, your last elevational studies. They're to me they're more provocative and subtle, or more maybe believable in a good way. That might make a really interesting project for that city. So again, congratulations. I know you had to work really hard and you had a lot, everyone had a lot on their plate this year. So really great job all in all. And I really, really, really appreciate your thinking.
Yes, super thorough. Very impressive.
Thanks, Jordyn.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Hitoshi, you're just gonna have to just, figure it out as you go, no worries. And we're gonna get Arthur. I think I probably have to help Arthur open up his screen.
Even I'm trying to log on. Do I need to join concept board? It looks to
You
me.
unfortunately do, I think, just for a moment.
You can do it as a guest. I think you can
jump
just join as a guest. You don't need to create an account or anything.
Okay.
But that was super helpful, by the way. It was, even if it wasn't a Zoom thing, just for us to see things at our own pace.
Yeah, we did our mid review just on concept board, and I have to say it was very it was good, but also very hard to do. And then this is much more organized, but then to have the backdrop to be able to actually look at things you need to look at, I think is also valued. So I'm going to get quiet and let Arthur do his thing. And thank you.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Hello. Thanks for taking the time to meet with us today. I'm Arthur, and this is Some Kinds of Porosity.
Well, you're breaking up. Is it just me?
No, it's kind of got an echo.
It probably is him. Arthur, you just have to speak slowly and do the best you can. Don't worry. There's nothing you can do.
Okay, yeah, that's
fine.
Okay, so as Steven already said, the project's located on a city block in downtown Los Angeles, and it holds a lot of different programs, just hotel, retail, office, housing. And I saw in this an opportunity to, instead of making 3 or 4 different buildings, I'll make one single mass that would hold all the different programs, enabling interactions that wouldn't normally happen. So the amount of the program that we were given is also half of the building area on the site. So this would generate then an extremely porous building. With this in mind, I divided this programmatic mass that I had in a square grid, and each cube of the grid would then be 50% solid and 50% void, as you can see in these modified cubes down here. Which brings me to the first kind of porosity. This is the most literal kind of porosity. It's expressed to the bends, the movements on the exterior of the building. It's generated through the distribution of the modified cubes along the 5 facades, creating a homogeneous and isotropic facade and giving the illusion of randomness. On the short elevation, you can see how the language provides space for light and air to come in, and also creates visual connections, and it shapes the profile of the building. The language was developed through a series of formal explorations. This one was about how the modification of the faces of a cube can create interior and exterior spaces. And then those spaces could then be combined to create a third kind of space, an in-between space. On the top left, you can see how this language with something as simplistic as a cube can be modified into something more complex while still retaining some of the cube's original qualities. On the bottom, you can see how the language was incorporated into an actual building on this white, massive, monolithic models, which brings me to the second kind of porosity, the more literal kind that's expressed through the material of the building, the different qualities that each material can bring, qualities of light, bring to the interior spaces. And the materials would then be organized depending on the depth of the cut. The deeper the cut goes, the clearer it gets, but also on the amount of light needed in the interior spaces. Here you can see an early rendition of the roofscape. You can observe the fluidity of the design, which almost lacks visual hierarchy, which contributes to the illusion of randomness, which brings me to the third kind of porosity, probably the most hard to see. It's about the connection in between programs. It's about the circulation, the intersection, and the transition spaces. This bottom diagram simplifies the distribution of the program on a cross-section. The programs were organized in a way that programs with overlapping qualities would be adjacent to each other. Also, according to privacy, degrees of privacy needed, housing in a hotel being elevated from the street front, and also with, it was about the amount of light needed for each program, with office and circulation being located in the middle. Here you can see the interlacing of all the different programs, not only in a cross section, but on a plan too. You can start seeing the intersectional spaces like the atrium in green on the top, that's a shared space in between housing units and also apartment hotel units. And then you can also see on this plan in the middle over here, you start seeing these intersections. There are intersections in between offices and co-living units. There's intersections that can be used as a lobby for the co-living, but also as a break room for the offices, and even as a hub for the whole floor. This organization also allows for the adaptability of the program, even though it's like a very rigid and gridded organization. The housing on top could easily become a hotel, and the hotel could become housing depending on the demand. And then the office could be either one single office or can be broken up in 3 different offices. The section, which it's pretty similar to the first diagrammatic section, shows the adjacency of the programs and how communities that wouldn't necessarily meet each other have the ability to connect with each other. It also shows how the language can dictate the interior space, how the difference of, for example, a 2-bedroom and a 3-bedroom unit could be dictated by how deep the cuts goes on the facade. Here you can also see the connection between the spaces with the intersection spaces over here connecting the different programs on the whole floors. This long elevation demonstrates the homogeneity of the facade. It makes the building with different programs on the inside looks like it's just one thing, and you can't really tell what's going on in the interior just through the outside, which makes a highly striated building looks like a random thing. So in conclusion, this was an exploration of simplicity and complexity, the striated and the smooth, the conventional and the unconventional, and also a research of some kinds of porosity, the visual, the physical, and the experiential. Thank you.
I have a question, Arthur. Actually, you know, this really beautiful object, right? This kind of a, I don't know what to say. Maybe, sorry if I'm using, you know, wrong analysis, but it's almost like a car being crushed by this machine, right? Mm-hmm. So that it has an incredible kind of a winkles around and creating little pocket spaces. But if you do draw the section, actually this thing is happening around the periphery and not much inside. And I'm just curious to know why you didn't really do that and it kept the inside is very sort of in a way normal. Can you talk about that?
That was, it came from the original studies. For example, I started with cubes, and then I made the cubes less simplistic and more complex. So with this, I treated the program as if they were cubes. So they were simplistic and almost like generic, and then they start becoming complex and being shaped by the outside. So it's a clash between the outside and inside, which the conventional and the unconventional.
I think, you know, as much as I love the way you treated the facades and also the space you designed, but I see that some kind of a division, like from between inside and outside, and then maybe, you know, I don't know. I mean, I think maybe you could push this aspect a little bit farther to integrate that, so that kind of the transition can be a little more smooth, probably. But it's incredibly beautiful object. You know, I do appreciate that.
It's funny, it doesn't seem porous at all. It does feel like Hitoshi's saying, like it's been compressed and compacted. It might have been porous when it was a 4-block thing, but now it's a 1-block thing. So I kind of, I think the relationship between the inside and the outside is also something that would be worth your thinking about more, because like, go back to that section you were just showing us, that one, So we don't see any of the cubes there, right? That's lost now, even though you've really beautifully morphed them on the outside. And I think your studies of color are also really fantastic on the outside, but none of that comes through. It's like a different guy did the interior. And there are two ways I think that your project could like reflect what's great about the outside back onto the inside, and a little bit vice versa. One would be to get the sort of module that you're using to be more reflected in the section, which seems like a really natural pressure that the way you're thinking and the way the exterior is expressed would happen in this otherwise kind of pancaked section. But the other is where you actually have some porosity and open space. And I'm thinking real porosity, not metaphorical porosity. It'd be interesting to see if you could express some of that on the outside to give somebody a surprise or a hint about this geode that you've made, that was, if you cracked it open, there's something different in there. So hinting about the like big atrium at the upper level or the big atriums at the lower level on the exterior would, I think, add another level of complexity and relationships that your project has in it already, but doesn't quite formally express.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think there's something really interesting that you're working on and developing here. I think there's representationally, I think there's some interesting things that you're exploring. Formally, the object is like, when you were kind of taking us through the, I don't know if it's a GIF or kind of setup of like, you know, you went through the motions and you like said stacked and then differentiated, right? And you kind of talked about how you actually kind of developed this. I think there's an interesting kind of formal strategy, but I think what I'm missing is like, well, how do you interrogate that afterwards, right? Okay, so you've arrived at this thing. How do you then make it work more for what you're trying to do? And I was kind of looking at this kind of term that you're mentioning, illusion of randomness, right? Which at the beginning I was like, okay, I get it. And I was like, no, hold on, illusion, randomness, the illusion that those are in opposition, right? So you're kind of setting up this like entirely like oppositional kind of structure for what you're trying to kind of set up, which then I was like, oh, so maybe that's why he's got the outside and the inside as these, you know, I'm trying to kind of figure out like, how does the setup of the project and the way that you're kind of setting up the project allow you to kind of explore the form that you're kind of developing, and how does that actually then kind of create the spaces that you're after? So I kind of wonder if, I totally agree with Dana and Hitoshi that the kind of desire is to really kind of bring some of that crenellation into the interior, either by like allowing some of these like spaces to kind of push all the way through, or another option would be to actually treat the interior. So is there a larger void in the middle? that actually gets treated like an exterior space. So then you have pressure from both sides, right? So I don't know if that works with a car compacting kind of parallel, but there would need to be two cars with an object between them trapped that would like get caught in this machine, right? To be able to kind of create a kind of interior. Because in the top right-hand corner of your concept board, sorry, this is the like pointing in the upper right hand, where you have the kind of the way the patterning, I think it's in that top right hand, if that's correct, yeah. Where you're kind of showing how all of those things reaggregate. I thought that you'd be actually like allowing that ribbon to come in on itself rather than like become the volume. I actually thought you'd almost have it like snake in on itself. So like curling up on itself in order to be able to create that interior pressure that you were setting up. So it's just another way of getting at, you know, I think there's some really interesting ingredients that you're working with, and you've set yourself up with a really interesting kind of problem to be working with. I think it's more about how do you kind of push the tools that you've invented for yourself to do more work for you relative to what you're setting up.
Well, I guess I see this project a little bit differently. When I look at it, I feel exhausted. There's just so much difference, but the difference seems to me to be sort of the same thing. So, but I think we're all coming to the same conclusion, which is, well, maybe if you can create the outside so that there is some kind of relief and some kind of storytelling about what's happening on the inside, and take some of that excitement from the outside and bring it inside so that it lives up to its promise. I think that would, so if you can just like play with that somewhat and see if that will get you a more fulfilling project. And I have some like sort of mundane question. So about the floor plans.
Yeah.
So you have, I don't know on which floor, you have retail on the inside of the...
Yes, I do. I have like this open space here, and then I have some retail on the more of the back of the building. That could be like a restaurant or something that can extend through like into this courtyard kind of thing.
But sort of practically that usually doesn't work, at least in America. It works really well in other more dense places, but not so well here. So you might want to rethink that, or maybe again, open the building up more from the outside so that that retail can be seen more and can be participating in the street life, etc. And then also the other question was about the child care center. And again, I wouldn't encourage it to be participating in the street life, but somehow have a more relationship to the outside space, maybe to the alley or something like that would make it a much better place to be.
You mean the daycare, like over here?
Yeah. So maybe you can switch that with the retail, some of the retail, do a garden, because you need, of course, outdoor space for daycare.
Like the main streets over here, and
I'm sorry?
the main streets like over here.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So I was reading it backwards. So good job.
Never mind.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting review. All in all, very interesting. I agree with the critics in that the level of porosity needs to now be increased to add more nuanced spaces. There's probably more of that in there when you look at the plan. You start to see there probably are, it's probably more open than it comes across. And I think, to be honest, this is an interesting research kind of project, which I really enjoyed working with you on and watching you develop in an incredible level of expertise. Very difficult project in general that we provided to the students, but also in terms of their ability to organize the spaces in a logical way, and then also deal with this kind of interesting question of porosity and density and the confusion around that. And that when you look at the building, it looks, monolithic, as you said. I loved Hitoshi's commentary of a crushed, it's so dense and yet it's porous, and it's about working on that porosity so that it surprises you, because you could have used screens in probably more seductive ways to have created the illusion, a little more illusion of being a facade, but then having porosity behind that facade might have been another next level. It's all next level stuff. It's also not, you know, this is a semi-impractical project. So I love our pragmatists who are kind of working with us on the commentary of it, because it helps me really, it helps him to understand how you can have a research project of this nature, but can we create this kind of visual density, as you said, striation, to such an intensity that maybe it is appropriate. I mean, as a commentary, as a difference, I think it's a really valued exploration for you. So I don't know if Izzy has anything left to say here, but I applaud you for your effort and also the intensity.
Thank you.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Nadthachai Kongkhajorjkidsuk. I also go by INT for short. I think that's a lot easier. And thank you so much for coming in today. And I'm really honored to be presenting my project to you guys. And yeah, this is my project Joy Cluster. And what I want to propose with this project is a way to break down a monolithic nature of a typical urban mixed-use building, not just in its form, but also in its organization and also its performances as well, by introducing a series of interstitial spaces between public and private, indoor and outdoor, and from one program to another, to ultimately allowing each inhabitant to not just celebrate their singularity, but also the community's collectivity as well. So I first began my study and analyze of how the use of modular unit, which is porous in both its plan and section, can be used as a base of my aggregation. And through that aggregation, it can result in a field of cluster of all this module that once you start to look at the plan and so also the vertical section, you're starting to see a variety of spaces that's not just indoor or outdoor, but also the in-between spaces as well. So I want to use that architectural concept and apply that into the programmatic aspect of the project. So I first looking at the housing program and how I can design a module, a housing unit module that has the same porosity, and which is also constructed and with the prefabricated CLT panel, and with the nature of the CLT prefabrication nature, which is almost really dollhouse-like. It's like one panel to another. It's allow inhabitant to understand how each of the unit is put together, which doesn't only promote ownership, but also giving room for customization even before the construction it actually begins. And speaking of customization, these units can also be added to give more spaces as well. And using the same module that has the same porosity and just the very simple move of just stacking and also removing certain parts, you can have like this variety of module units that through all this operation can fit into like different needs for different demographics of people, such as micro units, or just like single family, or like more than like a co-live workspace as well, live work situation. And all these units then come together through the cluster organization with a simple operation of either rotating, stacking, and by introducing horizontal or vertical circulation, the cluster is then formed. And then in this slide, you can see how the module that we start with then starting to come and become a part of this bigger 3-floor cluster that you can see in this one that each unit is still being celebrated with its color and patterns, but then you can read a whole cluster as a feel whole thing. And then once all the two cluster of this come together, and just by rotating and stacking, you're starting to see how the one housing cluster of different units of different demographics can come together. And in this slides, the plan and the section of this cluster show how the porosity and the variety of spaces can still remain when they come together. You can look at the plan diagram on the right, that each unit will have their own kind of patio or outdoor spaces, but then on the different levels, they have like this interstitial spaces where different units, different occupants of this different units can come together and have a smaller interaction that doesn't just have to happen inside like a big public park or public courtyard. And in this section, you can see the kind of vertical almost site continuity from one unit to another, and also the porosity it still shows. So this way of cluster can then be applied into different programs as well as the office cluster and hotel cluster. And this is just, and the way that they are organized is just through some customization of scales and also tectonic to allow more light and more floor areas into open plan office, but still keeping the variety in the programs that are associated with the office, such as a multi-purpose room, conference room, like breakout pod and lookout spaces. And the same thing kind of happened with the hotel, where recreational space and like all suite units is kind of on the far left, and then it's surrounded by the standard or like the 2-bedroom units. But so there's still like variety and like porosity in all this cluster. And in this slide, you can see how all this cluster come together and sit on the site with its own respective base. And you can see on the left is where housing cluster is, so to allow more light from south to come in and not be blocked by the tall building on the right corner lot. And then office cluster occupying the middle, and then the hotel cluster along with its restaurants and all the base program sit on the other side of the site to allowing views on the corner lot while also having the street exposure as well. And then for the next couple slides, you will see how all this cluster coming together and how people would move through this whole building. So first, you can see how like from Main Street, how people will get in from the ground through a different kind of entrance, and we'll get right into the accessibility elevator, and while also having a cross circulation from one side of the site to another. And then as you come into the building, you are like firstly introduced to the small public green spaces that sits right between like different clusters. And then as you go into each cluster, it also has its own circulation and get out through the mean of egress in case of fire, of course. But I think most importantly of all is the in-between spaces between these cluster, and also the in-between space between the cluster and also the street front and like the public and the private, as it should not just be a circulation spaces where you move from one program to another, but actually it could be something that you can truly occupy and truly has a function that allow people from these different programs and different demographic to actually come together and to actually interact. So in this presentation, I would like to only focus on one interstitial space, which is the interstitial space between two housing cluster. So you can see in this one, in this axon, that the in-between circulation from the second floor of the first cluster to third floor can act as a threshold into a hidden chapel beside that sits right in between all this cluster. And I think it's through really like carefully analyze the sun and the shadows and the placement of this in-between spaces that you can truly design something that when some people thought it would just be like a leftover space between like these different programs can truly be something that allow people to actually come together and have like this social interaction between one another. To kind of re-emphasize what I've been kind of talking about, you can look at the ground floor plan and you can see all the programs that sit right on the main street has a profile that leads the pedestrian right into inner programs, and also like the courtyard as well. And on the right, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on the 11 is the first interstitial space between office and the hotel, which is an elevated platform with a mural wall on the end, which can be seen from the street as well. And the circulation also goes across the whole site, and that's the hidden chapel that I was talking about earlier. And then on the second ground floor, you can see another interstitial space between the housing cluster and the office cluster, which then turn out to be co-working spaces. And On the fourth floor, you can see how all these clusters are starting to take its unique characteristic, with housing cluster having patio spaces and room for customization and addition, while office have higher and like bigger floor areas, while still having that interstitial space between two office, which can act as like a lounge or community spaces. And then on the right, you can see the bridge that bridge between office cluster and the hotel cluster. And within the hotel cluster, there's a in-between space between recreational and also each hotel units. And lastly, I want to talk about my concept through section. And first, this is a section that cuts through the hidden chapel that I was talking about earlier and the housing cluster. And you can see how the public ground kind of connect the two together. And then in this one, you can also see how the circulation space from one housing cluster to another can act as a threshold into the chapel as well. And then another section, cross section, that shows that cuts through two housing cluster, showing the bridge in between, and also the activity that's also going on inside as well. And lastly, elevation. That I think this elevation shows how the idea that I was kind of talking about earlier, how the like singularity and collectivity can be celebrated through the patterns and colors. And lastly is the long section that shows how all these spaces connect together. And you can see how housing cluster starting to have the porosity and connects to the office cluster as well. And then the office cluster then have the interstitial space of the elevated platform that is connected to the office, and that which has its own kind of recreational, like the ballroom and the venue as well. And yeah, I think I just want to conclude my presentation that I think it's very important that within this urban building, the importance of the interstitial space is very important, as it doesn't only allow one to move from their private realm to another, but also providing this transitional liminal spaces that would allow one to be comfortable in their own skin, but also still having the ability to connect with other people as well. And thank you so much for listening. And yeah, I think that is it for me.
Okay, I really like this project. I think it's impressive on every level, and you know, it's something architects always are going for, right? Kit of parts and different pieces that you can stack in different ways. So it's not a new idea, but I think the way you've handled it has made it really fresh. That it's really created within. This is sort of a tough part of the city, and within that part of the city, you've created sort of hilltown kind of villages that can be there. I think your interstitial spaces are very convincing. They're all different from each other. And yeah, I think you've really achieved a lot of the things that you're aiming for. So in your spare time, have you spoken to like Michael Maltzen or somebody that's worked with these prefab spaces? Because I know that the reason why we're always dreaming about it and it rarely happens is how tough it is, you know, to make it happen. So I don't know if you've had that opportunity, but he's sort of a great guy, and I think he would like to talk.
Hello.
And it's
I'm sorry. I mean, I think you kind of broke up at the end. I'm super sorry. Can you maybe repeat the last 5-10 seconds?
no, my last point was that the screen was frozen. That was it.
Oh, okay, for sure. Can you actually, would you mind repeating the name of the person you just told me?
Yeah, what? I'm sorry.
Can you,
Michael
would you?
Maltzen. It's just Michael. Maltzen. Yeah.
Okay.
He's a USC. He doesn't. Yeah, no comment.
Yeah. I know I haven't spoken to him at all, but yeah, I think the Getov parts, I've been intrigued, just like representationally through, not maybe like prefabrication, but just, yeah, like watching like earlier Tom Min's work with morphosis and how he like drew everything. I think it's like really easy for one to understand. And then we, of course, with our Allyne program, we have a lecture class with theory class. And my professor, Sarah Hearne, actually, we talk a lot about prefabrication and the history behind it with like the case study home and things like that too. And I know how tough and also how controversial it could be. But I think, yeah, I think now with like the CLT and everything, I think there's like a chance that it could actually work. So I just want to propose it in that manner.
I have a two completely separate question. CLT is only used for the residential component and then not for the commercial or other one. I just want to know from where to where, which kind of structure system you're using. And the second question is actually, it was a little bit difficult to understand that how the zoning of the each functions are kind of connected, right? I can see that there's a big chunk of sort of a public kind of a facility, and then sort of residential is on top of it. But can you clarify that how these functions are actually bonded? I know there's a kind of interstitial space bridging it, but somehow I see the big chunk, and then there's a lots of residential kind of sprinkled. By the way, it's a beautiful project. I really like the way that the courtyard spaces and then also the section is, you know, very good. But just, you know, I have to be a little bit critical, right?
No, thank you so much. No, I think that's a really fair question. But I think, again, thank you so much for your compliment. It really means a lot. Actually, the CLT actually only exists in the, if I can go back to some of my slides, the CLT only exists in the residential part, and the rest is concrete construction. Like you can even see in this section that like it's actually or this housing cluster actually sit on like a podium, like concrete podium base, and it's kind of similar to the one building that Mad Architects doing on Wilshire in LA. I'm not super sure. I forgot the name of the building.
So section is beautiful, but if you could actually draw the section indicating the concrete as a platform and then CLT is being sitting on it, the section could be much more beautiful.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, noted. And maybe to answer your second question, so each, maybe you can look at the slides. So like each housing cluster is kind of sit on top of like its own kind of support space that it kind of act as like a base, but then it also have its own like kind of somewhat interstitial spaces. And then so like each one kind of have its own purpose. Like on this housing cluster, there's like a housing cluster of like recreational, so that has like recreational space, while this has like more of the housing study and also like gallery spaces. So each one of them kind of sits on like this kind of base that has like different program as well. And maybe if we can go back super fast to the on axon, you can see how maybe like in here, like office kind of sit on top of retail, and like the hotel kind of sits on top of restaurants, and with like the lobbies kind of being like also in like incorporating as well with like some like interstitial space as that act as a threshold into the site. I don't know if that's answered your question. I don't know if that's clear.
Sure.
It does make you, I mean, I also think it's a beautiful project, but beautifully presented. I mean, the presentation was super artful and clear and really engaging. And I was convinced about porosity in that little part of the program that you love, which is the hidden chapel. And the fact that it actually seems to work was kind of a demonstration that you actually did achieve some of the porosity in the midst of this density that we've been asking about in other projects. So it makes me think that the focus on a single space is really valuable to test your theories about density and porosity. So I also, though, feel like the connection between the three buildings you've made, like what kind of relationship do you want between the housing and the office and the hotel, isn't very clear. And it sort of begs for a big move. in my mind, like a ribbon of public space that moves through it. That's a different kind of entity. And that seems like it would really thread literally your project together in a way that would make the pieces adequately independent, but provocatively joined. So I think I can see that. There's a couple of other things I would just like to point out that I think are not as well resolved as the massing. And I think you probably are super aware of them because you sound very competent about all these ideas. One is just the elevations. The way you treat glazing is really just like Photoshop smoother. You know, it's just like, I'm going to smear it on anything that's vertical in between all the things that are horizontal. And, you know, that has a tendency, I think, to reinforce the look of a manufactured entity. And maybe you want to communicate that in some places. You know, I think Stanley Seidowitz does that in some of his buildings where he assembles, aggregates. And I think aggregation is really the right term for the housing piece. But I don't think the other two are as much of an aggregation because you don't see the cellular nature. And that's where I'd like to see the elevations more carefully thought through. And then the only other thing is it looks like you actually incorporated an existing building on the site that you didn't design here at the short end that we're looking at the lower part of the drawing that's on the screen now. Like, where did that come from? Who did that one? Because I don't know why you'd have a conventional tower that seems to be holding in all the fragments that are behind it. But it feels like it came from an earlier part of your thinking, so.
Yeah, it's almost like it's kind of hemming everything in kind of on the side.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned that, Dana. I also noticed, and I was like, I wonder if I missed something in the site analysis that there's a building. But I agree with all the feedback, and you know, I think I just have a couple of thoughts. I agree that the presentation is very artfully and very well done, so congrats on that. It seems like, you know, you're very thorough in the way that you're kind of working through this, and it seems like it has been a generative process for you. Where you're kind of working through a lot of these things through drawing. So I think that's been pretty obvious in the way that you kind of spoke through talked through the project. I just in terms of piggybacking on some of the other comments and maybe giving you another tool maybe to kind of explore some of these things. I think Dana's suggestion to think a little bit of almost like an armature of a structure that can actually allow some of these things to start coalescing. I think you kind of have some ingredients of that. You have one, I noticed it in your black and white like kind of video where you have the one line of like public path that cuts like parallel to, I think it's Market, I don't know the streets. So where you have it kind of running straight shot through like half a building over or something. So that would have been something that you could have maybe taken a hold of more and taken ownership of it to allow it to either meander or allow things to dock into it or kind of have it become maybe something that would be much more of a feature and kind of much more articulated. The other comment I had was kind of one of interlock. Your project is kind of predicated on the interlocking of all of these different pieces, and that interlock happens at many multiple scales. And it's the interlock of like the one block to the other block, the one unit to the other unit, the unit to the cluster to the connector piece or whatever you're calling it, the connector to the other cluster, right? And right now you've kind of focused mostly on the big interlock, right? Between clusters and the chapel, which is maybe an aberrant in like the scale of interlock that you're kind of taking on. But I kind of wonder, I want to know how these pieces come together. Maybe that's piggybacking on Hitoshi's first point, which was like, how do these things come together? When they come together, does something magnificent happen? Or is it just like a puzzle piece that just like locks in and job done? Or is there a little bit of room that's kind of revealed? Or is there a pocket? Or is there a cutout? Or, you know, what exactly can happen at different scales of connection between the components that you're using? And I feel like that would have been a really interesting way to maybe address some of the questions, but also differentiate the project at multiple scales. Because I think that's some of the questions you're getting right now is that you're thinking, you've thought of it from the small and it's kind of built up to the big, but how are those qualities different, right? And you know, that they're getting equated maybe a little bit, just because maybe that hasn't been articulated as rigorously as.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Francois. My project is titled Our House in the Middle of the Street. It's inspired by the streets of downtown Los Angeles, the public forum for the city. This landscape is the space in which people from all walks of life interact and intermix. While Los Angeles is known for being a car-dominated city, it is on the street corners and in the crosswalks where social, political, economic, and cultural exchange takes place. Okay. In the abstract and scaleless studies which we did, I focused on compositions which played with connection and disconnection, networks of interstitial spaces connected and created by a field of objects which blurred the line between object in space and object as space. As the studio progressed, my interest in objects which interrupt and subvert the horizon using sky as field guided my progress. Something about seeing through and under another thing interests me and appeals to me. So to show you the longitudinal section of my project is to expose the manifestation of these ideas as applied to a mixed-use housing project. It privileges neither the horizontal nor the vertical planes as the project occupies this extensive site in an urban environment. So mixing programs through different methods of connectivity, and there you see it on the site with context. Maximizing an urban connection and visibility from outside and inside. So there really is no inside or outside. Here, this is you can see the vision of this section, and that's the visualization of an outdoor space. So the rest of the building envelopes you, but you don't feel like you're inside of a building. And the project program, we had some range of flexibility. And so this mixed use housing is seen as housing for artists, where office space really becomes studios and ateliers. So there's dance studios, fashion, all different kinds of media for artists to work and live and collaborate in this space, shared space. And so this is an animation of the cross sections, which show the relationships of space between housing, collaborative spaces, studios, and circulation. So the views that you can get depending on where you are and how you occupy the site and how you move through it. This is a north elevation and south showing, you can see circulation is on the southern side, yeah, in plan. So what existed on the site previously was a parking lot, and on the north corner there were some shops, and each shop was like a very narrow alley. So keeping with that tradition, a commercial alley surrounds the rest of the program, where artists can sell their goods and people can move through that as they get to their house or apartment. The first floor is very open, and that begins the transition into the rest of the project. This second floor shows the transition into more of a workspace with live work studios and larger collaborative spaces and galleries. And then these are the apartment plans. So the 3 towers are permanent housing, and the transient housing and studios occupy the rest of the site. This is a structural diagram. There's circulation throughout the building, and then glazing and different applications of that. And this is the early and transitional studies that I did, where I was interested on that vertical horizontal interplay and what reads as inside and what reads as outside on that very specific site in downtown Los Angeles. And to end, that is the section again. So I can stop sharing and go back to concept board. Or, oops.
Francis, I have a question. You are
Yeah.
using kind of particular kind of a technique to represent your sort of a project, right? So that you are actually renders a little foggy, right? The perspective, everything is a little bit, it almost like it reminds me of the 19th century industrial era where the steam was all over in the city.
Mhm.
And also, the beautiful object that you designed also kind of lacks lots of sort of a detail to sort of make people feel there's a kind of attachment to the space. It's more likely the dealt like a little bit like a beautiful arts object or machine, right?
Mhm.
Is there any intention so that somehow this object or this environment is more sort of like art project rather than actually kind of encouraging people to engage or something like that? So you want to clarify that?
Where it stands as an object versus like a environment.
Yeah, or actually, if you look at the previous project, right, you can
Mhm.
feel all people want to come in and enjoy, but
Mhm.
this one is more,
Right.
setting the environment in a different level. So
Yeah, and it really was an like a conversation about who the public for this project is. Is it the community that you're trying to create? So in my instance, it would be like a community of artists where it's more insular, or is it the community at large that you want people to engage, or do you want people to feel, more homely, if that's what you're asking?
it's more likely you almost rejecting that we feel like, oh, this is a nice environment to live. It doesn't look like it's a big matter for you.
No.
All right,
Yeah.
you have to kind of argue for it. So
Yeah, it feels to me like the voluntary prisoners of architecture project. Like there was a city that you found of those slabs in between, and then you captured them. And there's the bars that operate are this kind of very strict, kind of brutalist organization. I'm okay with brutalism. But when we look at your earlier concepts, there was a kind of inflection periodically that you could see in some of those. It's always bad to show your early concepts because then we say, oh, you should have gone there. But I think what it makes me think about is that, again, it's kind of consistent with the rest of your classmates insofar as the management of the program feels very competent in this. And I think that you found a kind of architectural expression for that. Maybe Hitoshi says it's too machinic, or I would say it feels like a city that's been captured. What's the project in London? The Smithson's thing. Like it feels it has that feeling of a megastructure, basically. And I think one thing that this project could handle is that somehow breaking the management level down to like inject a bit of like pleasure, um, irregularity, off the grid. The assembly of the modules on the grid feels oppressive at a certain point. And yours, I think, has a really beautiful larger order, like the replication of Skidmore or something, so there's a way in which I think you've really achieved something in that assembly, but it wants something that shows me like this is the place where the most important stuff happens. This is where you'd enter this project. It's at the street level where you put a lot of attention, that you'd like to see it raised up above the ground and then something more irregular happening, or it could have that anyway. Again, another really great presentation. I love the MRI kind of reading through the project. That is amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I kind of, I had a similar question about just the representational tactic and how that kind of plays out with your larger thought about the project. I think the reading of this thing is like a really kind of, what I find interesting about it is that representationally, it reads as this kind of brutalist, megalithic kind of, it's a big thing. But then when you talk about it, you're talking about the interstitial. And you know, when you started the presentation, it was all about the in-between space. And it's all about these like, you know, small artisan, intimate, like small spaces between. But the thing is like massive. And you have it land in such a kind of, you know, it just basically lands on the site without leaving, you know, any, with no kind of, give and take with the site that it lands on, that it seems a little incongruous. And I feel like you can either embrace that and say that's the point, right? That you as the designer can find those like small intimate spaces in this big thing. But then I would expect there to be a very different representational tactic from like the big megalith arriving to like that kind of small intimate space where maybe one could see difference, right? At a different scale, or maybe through a different material, or through like kind of gaining focus. So it's out of focus or it blurs at the big scale because it is so big and it is, you know, of that like larger scale. But then the minute it comes down to like, I don't know, 3 people, 5 people scale, or, you know, it's up to you to determine that, you know, that there's a kind of different scale of focus that comes to light at different scales of the building as well, right? So that would be a different, I'm just totally reading into the project here, right? But I'm kind of using your kind of initial like tactic that you described, and maybe some of the conversation that's kind of taking place now to maybe give you a way into it, which I think could have been really interesting. It would also make for it would be a really tricky kind of representation to be able to control, right? Because obviously the question at that point is like, well, what happens at the middle scale, right? Between those two, when it doesn't, you know, strictly belong to the megalith, the monolith, or the like intimate space, right? And I think that would actually bring up some of the other interesting aspects of the project that I don't necessarily think you dwelled upon as much, which are the between scales, right? The circulation space that happens like up above that connects some of those bars, right? Or, you know, what is it like to be in one of those spaces rather than just the ground space, right? Where you focus more on. So I feel like there's some interesting ingredients. I like that you're taking on kind of the representational tactic, but I'd love you to do that maybe a little bit more deliberately, and with maybe a little bit more kind of intentionality.
It would be great to see that, what Nataly's asking for, because the thing that you've achieved that I think we haven't seen in any of the other is at the overall scale, porosity. I mean, your project feels as much open as closed, and that's really not something that the others have managed. So is that possible architectonically to also have that mega scale porosity, massing and porosity with a middle level scale of kind of more articulated architectural expression? That's kind of the question that I see your project raises.
I think just visually, what you say its uses and what it appears to be are so different than each other. And I love the way it looks. It's very exciting. It's very clear. It looks like a really great hospital project to me. Different kind of small wards that would be there, and you know the connections are very clear and all that. But I often think when people do artist housing, it's a real cop out. You know, they want to do, oh, I'm going to do some low income housing. It's for artists, so you know they're the right kind of poor people. So I don't see anything in there that would make me think, oh, if I'm an artist, whether it's a dancer or a visual artist, whatever, that I would want to live there. But so maybe think it through a little bit more about how the users are going to use it and how can it achieve that differentiation that everybody is talking about today, and maybe sort of lose the edge that it has. But I think that there's sort of a strong party there, and it would be good to be able to keep going with that.
Yeah.
Again, the organization or space that you design is beautiful, actually, right? And I think right now, I just pointed out what I want to really point out is that design itself and how it's represented, and then who's the audience and who, what this building is for, are not aligned that well to reinforce the space you're proposing. I think you need to be a little bit careful about this kind of stuff.
Okay.
But the beautiful building and nice space, actually. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all.
Yeah, I'm very grateful that you had this version because no one else really had the guts to do it. And so it came out early that you had this, the building off the ground. And I think you explored that and pushed it and were willing to go there, even though we know maybe it's troubled as a concept. But it also adds to pressure on all the others that don't do that, right? I do think you took a way out with the modernist lingo, the way in which it became a bunch of boxes and gridded out. And that probably is not your expertise, maybe even. I think your architectural skills exceed that in some ways. But then the way in which you produced your presentation was beautiful and started out really beautifully. And I think everyone keyed in on that one. So I'm not 100% sure what you got out of being in LA Metro per se, but I know you learned a lot on the things that you wanted to, the way you wanted to, and you have a strength of character, which I highly applaud. And so grateful that we had this kind of scheme. So I don't know if the others want to check, Pavel, Teddy, or then we just move to Ezra. Any last comments? No? All right. Hey, thank you. Thank you. Let's jump to, is Ezra out there? I probably.
Yeah, I think, oh yeah, you have to share my video.
Yeah, I'll bring you out. Here we go. All right, thank you all. We very professional group this time. We stayed on target, on time. Really appreciate it. And I'll disappear. Are you on? There you go.
Yeah, I can start sharing my screen. Okay. Can everyone see the screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, well, yeah, thanks for coming out, everyone. I really appreciate it, and congrats to my peers who presented today. It was always great working with you guys throughout the 2 quarters. Okay, so this is my project, 2020 CE. And so the project aims to integrate primitive and iconic architectural shapes, such as domes and vaults, and short circuit them with urban strategies to study how a building with these kinds of primitive moves could fit into a contemporary context. And so looking into that site initially, I saw that long frontage of Main Street as an opportunity for the public to walk around and explore a distorted dome and arcade-like experience. And just to go over the programmatic distribution briefly, on the bottom levels, it's a mixture of retail, restaurant, gallery, and entertainment. The middle levels are primarily creative office and event spaces. And the upper levels are a mixture of housing typologies. Throughout the project, I'm interested in how these programs react and interact with these big or small domes and spherical cuts. And so throughout the 2 quarters, I've been interested in studying how these intersecting domes and vaults could shape space. Here are some of my early studies and a simulation model from where these ideas manifested. And so overall, I'm just interested in how the subtractions might influence the floor plan, how that language and scale could translate over onto the site, and especially how that texture and facade could develop as well. Here are some of my earlier studies of texture. I was really interested in how a pattern would map over different surfaces, choices of color, and how the placement of color creates new shapes and depth. At the top, you'll see my elevation of the dissimulation model. And when you compare it to its successor, you can really start to see some of these themes translate over. And here are some other elevation studies where I'm looking at different colors, patterns, and gradients over the building. And to really zoom in on that materiality, I tried to maintain a monolithic appearance with the domes, but while also implementing a lot of transparency through perforated aluminum panels. So the panelization on the front that you see is all operable, and the patterning inside of the domes is also perforated, so you can look down into the plazas and walkways. And so zooming into that dome at that Main Street crossing along Main Street, you can see there's a lot of terraces and ample transparency in the walls to provide sight clarity and visibility when walking around the public lower levels. And so on the ground floor plan, you can see the entries into the lower plazas and lobbies for upper program, but it's really that second floor highlighted in red on the lower right diagram that acts as a thoroughfare for the public to walk around. In the diagram, you can see a lot of different variations in height on the lower 3 floors, promoting overall greater exploration. And in the section, you can start to see how some of these spaces start to line up. And highlighted in orange is an example of those intersecting domes starting to line up. And in this rendered view, we're looking down into those orange highlighted spaces, where farther down you can even see a subterranean space, in this case, a little outdoor sculpture gallery for people walking by on the street to look down into that dome. And again, here highlighted in red in that same circulation diagram is that second floor public thoroughfare for people to walk around and explore certain shops and other domes in the building. Likewise, in this view, looking down into the Main Street crossing plaza, you can start to get a sense of what it might be like to be behind that panelized screen in the domes. And again, highlighted in red is that same public thoroughfare connecting a lot of different shops and other areas in the back. Here's a cross section through the building where you can start to see all the programs all at once. And as well, looking at in the bottom right, the creative office floor plan, you can start to see it sit in that middle chunk on top of and around the domes. And I was really interested in how those levels would start to fit around and on top of the structure. And because of the way that the spaces are stacked on top of the domes, you can start to create a lot of double height spaces on top of that form and structure. And so highlighted in orange on the creative office floor plan in the bottom right, you can start to see some of the double height spaces and areas that step down along that main floor. Also in this section, you can start to see some hints of the space frame structure that would help support and fill in a lot of those in-between spaces on top of the domes. So highlighted in red is that upper housing area. And so here in the left, you can see the distribution of all the housing on that upper area. But the spaces are primarily broken up between 2 courtyards and more collective spaces in the middle. So on the left is more longer staying residence, including a range of studios, 1-bedroom apartments, 2 bedrooms, and 3-bedroom units. And the right is more temporary stay residence, micro apartments, a transitional hotel, and boutique hotel. And on the upper levels, the architecture doesn't operate on the same grandiose scale as the lower levels, but instead is built on a smaller collecting spaces around domes and cuts. So in highlighted in red, you can start to see a lot of the outdoor spaces and like little in-between or outdoor spaces that act as public grounds for people to walk around. And so here you get a small visualization of what it would be like to be inside one of those outdoor spaces or courtyards. And in the back, you can see like an outdoor viewing terrace where people could view the rest of the city from this upper level. And to end it all off on this is a view of the building from Main Street and 9th. And then I also have all the slides on the left if you want to refer back to anyone. But thank you.
I think that this is the only project that we saw today that actually seems to me to like really reference the neighborhood. It's new forms, it's new materials, but you know the scale is very much how buildings used to be built, and you know the ground floor is special and it has particular materials, and you can each area has its own particular form and you know exciting places, and the upper floors are more utilitarian, and it seems to me to really fit into this neighborhood.
I have a question actually. You know, the main important gesture for your project is that you're curving out these spheres, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sequence of spheres. And, you know, it reminds me of the famous artist, right? I'm sure you know Gordon Matlock is known for cutting out those imaginary spheres from slabs and so on. And the differences between what he did and what you did is that yours are actually dealing the sphere as a figure, right? It's not the void, or it's not the sort of a, you know, the Gordon's work is basically cutting out. So you see the sort of a element being cut as a section, but you are intentionally putting the material and then hiding it. So I'm just curious, right? Because by carving it out, those structure, you will see incredible complexity, right, in the shape, but also at the same time creates a relationship between the space being cut out and also space being cut. What am I saying? Like inside and outside relationship. So can you talk about it a little bit? Because I thought it's kind of cutting in, you know, these spheres into this, let's say new, but the kind of existing structure, right? And creating sequence of such kind of a relationship could have been really beautiful. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think I'm starting to understand some of what you're talking about. But yeah, throughout the, especially in the beginning of the project before we got the program, at a really basic level, I was interested in a lot of themes in terms of like intersecting of those spherical shapes. And I kind of always imagined that in the very blunt way that I would have to fill in this thing with floor plates. So it's always been like a weird push and pull of how I could make like some spaces and floor plans around it. And I've kind of always like intuitively thought about it as those big cuts as like collecting spaces and viewing plazas for people to gather and look down into, no matter what program that they're kind of existing on the inside.
And I think one of the things that it seems like you're doing, and I'm trying to kind of understand a little bit more about how you're setting up the case for this project. It seems like right now these domes are primarily on the periphery, right? Mm-hmm. You're cutting, but you're cutting like from the public, let's say, into the mass, right? Mm-hmm. None of them are actually happening internal to the mass. Is that, I mean, that's how and I know you said that the top floors have their own, let's say, logic, but right now there's no like double negative, for lack of a better term, happening internal to the mass. It seems to be primarily happening kind of on the edges and the periphery, which I think would have been, may have been another way for you to kind of explore like how these geometries would have an impact in a let's say more typical kind of like mass rather than like the sidewalk, right? Where it's almost like giving you like, of course it'll make that kind of grand urban gesture, but what would it do if it was actually like between an office and a home, right? Does it have a different, does it need to kind of behave in a different way in order to be able to kind of take on that scale of operation? That could have been kind of a way to kind of test that out, because it seems like you're setting up the project at least that's how you started off by talking about like how the primitive and the iconic kind of collide with the urban, right? And how you basically have like these primitive forms and shapes and how they actually kind of collide or come into like friction with the urban realm. But you haven't necessarily, so you've given us there's a geometry for the building itself, but you haven't told us what does the urban realm bring back into this, right? Other than just the sidewalk that extends into it, right? Is there a way that some of the urban actually seeps all the way up into the building, whatever that may be, right? Does it have to do with circulation that you can actually start like, you know, cutting through this in a maybe much more kind of specific way that would kind of maybe connote more of the urban realm and how that collision actually happens? So you would actually be orchestrating it not just at the sidewalk, but you'd be orchestrating it maybe through circulation or the main circulation path. The other interesting thing that I was thinking about when you showed this cross section is that kind of infill space, which you're just kind of, you're using it to kind of fill it with structure, which obviously I told it, yes, you're gonna need structure somewhere in there to be able to hold that dome up. But it's strange to me that it gets hidden entirely, right? The texture and the pattern that you're, you know, so interested in, it seems like it could either learn from the structure beneath it, or the structure beneath it could escape and become like canopy or become like I don't know, parapet or whatever it would need to happen so that it actually can kind of become part of the articulation of the form. I think that could have been an interesting way to start allowing those layers to maybe reveal themselves and maybe become a little bit more operative.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of your comments. One of the main things that, you know, if I could develop this more, would really start to rethink that circulation around the domes to the upper levels. I've always had like, you know, flashes of inspiration of like, well, how could like circulation happen like along the dome? So
it's hard,
like,
yeah, no.
you know, like a lot more connected in that on that level. But yeah, that's kind of something I just always.
And I think you were getting at it, right? Where you had the pink highlights, where you're showing us the people and how they actually kind of engage with the dome. So that's it's giving a hint that, you know, obviously that's something you were considering. But
I really liked those little like balconies or pink zones, because the scale was so shocking. Like, oh, there's 3 of those total, and those people are that thing is huge. Yeah. No, it's one other drawing where you're really at a distance and you can just see them. I think it's in
one of the first ones that you had,
those, that's right. But you know, I think, Ezra, the choice of the word dome is really problematic, because there's one dome. I see it right here at the bottom. I'm not even sure if that's dome or just an elevation. In the long elevation, the center of the drawing, there's one complete arch or dome. Really, it feels like a series of voids that you've created through, like you've taken a kind of Swiss cheese and it's extrapolated. And I think that's really the power of it, is the ambiguity of the sort of formal work you're doing. And that's clearly what interests you. And I'm all for it. Like, okay, just stick some housing in behind and let's see if this, you know, spherical extraction can add up to something that's, you know, architecturally interesting. And you run really close, it seems to me, against a number of possible problems, but you just barely avoid them, which is good. But I'm not even sure if you're aware of it. Like, it almost looks like a mall at a place, in a couple of places. And it's only when that void becomes super dominant and completely unclear what it's for that it avoids that, because a mall would never have that kind of lacking in pragmatism. The other place I think you really, like, it could have a kind of symbolism of an Islamic architecture, because it really feels more like arches, but you break that by these weird brick patterns that don't coincide with the form that you've shaped. So there's a series, I think, of formal moves that are kind of great, and they seem to be under control. but you don't talk about them very specifically. And I think you should drop the term dome and never say it again. Here's the other thing I think that would be really like the next implication of what you're doing, which is it's so energetic on the first, 5 floors. And when you get to the cap, it really, I don't know, it's contradictory or unattended. And I think you would want to have a formal approach to that, like that instead of spherical extractions, you'd have solids that were made there, or the scale of the bubbles. I mean, that's really the other thing. It feels like a set of bubble structures that then have left the residue of building around them, that scale would become repetitive at the upper level, but tiny, much tinier. So it would be as if it frothed up there instead of expanded like big yeast at the bottom. But I think either way, your own logic didn't get carried to the top. And I'd like to see what that would be. And, you know, all these projects, yours included, are so thorough that it's hard to even talk about like what you might do next. They feel like way more complete than we typically look at in an architectural review. And that's really satisfying as a juror, because you can talk about the real implications of your intentions and how you've formulated them. And, you know, I really like this project. I think you've, I don't know, challenged a lot of ideas about the city and the program and about form through that. I have no idea how you'd make it. Those little trusses that are going around the top seem absurd, but I suppose Stephen made you do that. So
not necessarily. We've got Pavel's here. We also have Fabio, so he would have reviewed it with structural, but I don't know. What did they say? What did Fabio tell you to do?
pour it out concrete or something.
Did he not look at that? He didn't say, yeah, concrete. By the way, Dana, really appreciate your comment about the brick pattern too. It was once herringbone, which I thought had a different aesthetic. Brick and the, you know, I've been kind of on my class about not using the word vault. And well, vault may be okay, but dome and arch, because it has this Roman implication and it's an imperialist kind of history. And it's like, this is more cartoonish on a different level. It's a different use of shape, and to put it with that Roman brick pattern just immediately took me to Roman museum basically, and I didn't want to be there, you know, for this kind of, yeah.
A dome is a, you know, is a structural thing, and you don't have a single one of those. So I think that's part of what really.
That's what, yeah.
I mean, actually, on his section, if you move back a little bit, you're going to see it's a space frame structure, which is cladded with, let's say, ceramic tiles, and it's only some of the sections. So you just, oh, it's here. Yeah. You can see it right there. So it's basically a skin, and we went through this couple of times. So it actually works in a very contemporary way. If you look at the latest thing, which I think Norman Foster did a couple of things like this. It's is not, I agree with the rest of you, this is not a dome. It's not, you should look at it like purely abstractly as a sphere or as a three-dimensional curve or further. So we should take this off the conversation, dome or is not.
Well, that's an interesting one, right? Because, you know, there's the vault house, which had a different use of it. Again, you know, fantastic project. I loved at the beginning, and I think you worked meticulously through it. I have, you know, this is like our urbanism group today, you know, in some ways, and I tried to take some of our most interesting urban projects, and I think you did, as you know, Allyne even began the conversation. You carried a nice urbanism in this project, and I think we've always made the comment that the housing needs to step up to the same level, and it never quite got there. In terms of thinking it as a mini urbanism or thinking about its relationship both to itself and to the city. But I appreciate your development. I'm curious to see what you do next in your journey as an architect. It's an accomplished project like many of the others. So I don't know if we have any last comments from the reviewers. It's been a good day for us. Nice to be on time for a change.
I think there's one theme that really stands out to me. You know, people always struggle so much, particularly at the beginning of the project. What's the right answer? And what should, you know, is this better? Is that better? but I think every student really made a commitment to whichever way they were going to go and really carried it through and had a lot of thought and detail and commitment to it. So I think, Stephen, that has a lot to do with you, but they're all really good projects, but I think also just the level that they rose to is impressive.
It's super like comprehensive. I think the command of this large of a site and this clear of a set of presentations is an amazing accomplishment. To have organized all that material and to have it detailed, I mean, like their floor plans for this. I never knew how many units there were or anything like that, but it didn't seem to matter because you could tell there was a kind of competency in it that would be to just go back to some tedious thing they did like, I don't know, 12 weeks ago. So that part I really appreciate, and I think they really got, I think the students must feel like they really got a lot out of this studio. I'm sure that they each would have this in their portfolio and be very convincing if you were looking to show what you were capable of doing. I think if I had one comment, it would be that the conceptual level seemed to maybe get buried by the level of care that you have to take to put all of that together. And I think it's really important as an architect to be able to step back and still be able to say, this is really my priority. And in a project this big, it's really hard to get back to that. It's sort of like saying, you know, this is my child and what I really like best about him is X. You know, it's like, hey, it's like 20 years, how could I summarize it into one thing? But that's kind of the way it has to work in order to explain a project that's as complicated as this. And I missed that. I think it was there and we just didn't see it today, but it also might be that as you start working out details of a project this complicated, you tend to lose the overall thread of the thing that you were trying to achieve. And, you know, that's something you never want to do as an architect, and it's very easy for it to happen.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think that would be the one thing that, you know, I felt like a lot of our conversations were like circling around was like, okay, so what was the initial intent and how does that carry through both in, you know, the way you talk about it, the way you present it, and then the way the form is actually developed. I think, I mean, it's been fun. I've really enjoyed kind of, you know, going through these like 5 different journeys. What I appreciate is that there are also 5 very, very different projects, like every single one of them aesthetically, representationally, argument, like all of them have like, they're very different, right? And I think that's kind of really interesting to have as a group for you guys, right? To be able to kind of see what everyone is kind of working on and kind of understand the different trajectories that a project can have. But it seems to me like, I believe most of you or some of you will be heading into thesis moving on next, right? So it seems like both the argument conversation, but then the kind of representational kind of uniqueness of each of your projects is something to really kind of maybe make note of as you move into your next, I guess, next year at this point. Congratulations.
Sorry that I'm late. So I kind of missed probably the introduction part of it, but great projects. I really enjoyed being here. And this is second year or? I mean,
no, this is undergraduate. It's fourth year. Fourth year undergrad.
I see. So they will do the thesis next year.
Yeah, they go on to do thesis next.
Good job, actually.
This is kind of a prep up to that in some ways.
Maybe what I will just say is that this project is over, but there's always something that you can actually carry on. And usually those kind of stuff will stick with you for a really long time. And I think if you could find it, if you can push it in the next project, then you're a lucky guy. So good luck with finding your own way to push the design, and yeah, maybe I can see it next year as well. Thank you very much again. Great project.
Thank you, critics. You're all terrific, and I'm sure the students were extremely appreciative, and also the rest.
Thanks for having us, Stephen. It was really great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great group. So thank you, and everyone have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.